Has a doctor ever refused to treat you? I came into the emergency room clutching my abdomen, in the same hospital I once worked as chief of surgery. After 2 hours, I finally got to see Dr. Harm, who barely glanced up at me and sighed like I'd interrupted something by being here. Let me guess, he said before I could speak. You're 90 years old, ate dinner too late, and now you're panicking. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is your imaginary emergency? When I said 8, he actually laughed. Right, everyone says 8. Real pain doesn't let you walk in here in your pajamas looking so put together. My pajamas were soaked with sweat from the pain. When did you last have your period? He asked with a smirk. When I said I was postmenopausal, he nodded like he'd solved everything. There you go. Hormones. They make women your age think every little cramp is a heart attack or appendicitis. Have you tried yoga? Maybe losing some weight? He typed something without examining me. I see a lot of hysterical women your age. Retirement gives you too much time to obsess over every little ache. I tried to explain that I knew my body, but he interrupted. Ma'am, I have actual emergencies to deal with. Young man next door got stabbed. That's real medicine. Your psychosomatic belly ache can be handled by your GP on Monday. He started to leave, but I grabbed the rails of the bed. Please, something's wrong. I can feel it. He pried my fingers off one by one. This is drug-seeking behavior. Are you here for pain pills? Because that's not happening. A nurse came in and Harm told her loudly, just anxiety, probably wants attention. Her husband probably doesn't listen to her anymore, so she comes here for someone to talk to. He didn't know my husband died 2 years ago in this very hospital. Don't waste resources on blood work. Give her some antacids and discharge papers. The nurse looked uncertain, but he snapped, did I stutter? Or do you want to be a doctor now too? When I asked for a different doctor, he got nastier. You want a doctor shop? Classic drug seeking. I'm noting this in your file. He pulled up my chart on the computer. Oh look, you've been here before. Frequent flyer. Lonely old women love the attention from young doctors. It's pathetic but common. He didn't scroll down far enough to see my employment history at this hospital. The pain was getting worse and I doubled over, which made him roll his eyes dramatically. The performance isn't necessary. I've seen better acting from kindergartners. He called another resident over. Watch this. Classic case of Munchausen's in the elderly. They Google symptoms and then pretend to have them. The resident looked uncomfortable but stayed quiet. She probably lives alone, kids don't visit, so she creates drama. I started describing my symptoms in medical terms, hoping it would help. The pain is intermittent, positional, with guarding in the upper quadrant. He cut me off. Oh great. You watched Grey's Anatomy and think you're a doctor now? Let me guess. You diagnosed yourself on WebMD? He turned to the nurse. She's using medical words she doesn't understand. Probably reads medical forums all day. These bored housewives always think they have whatever disease is trending on Facebook. When I stood up to leave and find another hospital, I collapsed from the pain. Instead of helping, he stood over me and said, this manipulation won't work. Get up. And you're taking a bed from someone who actually needs it. He didn't help me up, just watched as I struggled. In my professional opinion, you need a psychiatrist, not an ER. Maybe some friends, a hobby, anything besides wasting our time. He grabbed my arm roughly to pull me up, and I cried out, stop the theatrics. I'm documenting this as a psych case. You'll be lucky if insurance covers this visit when I'm done. He started dictating to his phone. Patient presence with fabricated symptoms, drug-seeking behavior, and hysteria typical of menopausal women seeking attention. He looked at me with disgust. Women like you clog up the system. You're why people with real problems wait hours. I vomited from the pain and he jumped back. Great. Now you're making yourself puke for sympathy. Clean that up yourself. He threw paper towels at me. I'm not exposing my staff to whatever attention-seeking disease you have. You know what? Get out. Leave. You're banned from this ER for abusing services. He was writing discharge papers when I passed out again. I heard him telling security to remove me when Dr. Vance, the current chief, walked in for his morning rounds. Dr. Callahan? Oh my God, what are you doing on the floor? He rushed over and Harm's face went white. You know her? Vance's voice was ice. This is Dr. Rebecca Callahan. She was chief of surgery here for 10 years. She hired me. She's on the board. I hope you've been treating her well. Vance then felt my abdomen and immediately started barking orders. Get an OR ready now. This is a mesenteric torsion with compromised blood flow. She needs emergency surgery or she'll lose her intestines. Harmon's clipboard clattered to the floor. Has our staff been okay so far, miss? Vance asked me. I turned to Dr. Harm. My voice came out steady even though pain was shooting through my whole body. Dr. Harm refused to examine me and called me hysterical. I watched Vance's face change from worried to angry in about 2 seconds. His jaw got tight and his hands balled into fists. He tried to have security remove me from the ER. The words made everyone in the room freeze. Nurses stopped moving. The security guard who'd been walking over backed away. Vance's face went red and then white again. He stood up slowly and turned to look at Harm, who was still holding his clipboard like a shield. Get an OR ready right now. Vance's voice filled the whole ER. He pointed at Harm without looking at him. You don't move from that spot. 2 nurses rushed to get a gurney while Vance grabbed his phone and started barking orders about getting the anesthesiologist down here immediately. The whole ER had gone dead quiet except for Vance's voice. Even the guy who'd been moaning in the next room stopped making noise. Harm opened his mouth, but Vance held up one hand to stop him. The nurses lifted me onto the gurney, and I bit my lip to keep from screaming at the movement. My whole belly felt like it was on fire, and every bump made it worse. They started wheeling me toward the elevator, and I could hear Vance behind us telling Harm he was suspended effective immediately pending a full review. Harm started yelling about being overwhelmed and understaffed, but Vance cut him off with words I couldn't make out. The last thing I saw before the elevator doors closed was Harm's face going from white to bright red like he might explode. The OR prep area was cold and bright, and the anesthesiologist was already there setting up her equipment. She had gray hair and gentle hands that didn't hurt when she touched my arm to find a vein. "I'm going to take good care of you, Dr. Callahan." She kept explaining each step while she placed the IV, and I noticed her hands were completely steady, even though she kept shaking her head. "Yeah, I've worked here 15 years, and I've never seen Dr. Vance that angry." The mask went over my face, and she told me to count backward from 10. "I just want to survive this," I managed to say before the drugs kicked in. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in recovery with tubes everywhere and a different kind of pain than before. This wasn't the sharp stabbing from earlier, but a deep ache that went through my whole middle. The PACU nurse was checking my vitals and smiled when she saw my eyes open. "Welcome back, Dr. Callahan." She adjusted something on my IV pump. "The surgery went well, but it took 3 hours to fix everything." She wrote something on her clipboard. "Dr. Vance wants to speak with you when you're ready, but there's no rush." My throat was dry, and she gave me ice chips that hurt going down. That evening, Vance came to my room looking tired and older than this morning. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down heavily. "Rebecca, I need you to understand how close this was." His voice was quiet but serious. "Your intestines were twisted, and the blood flow was almost completely cut off. If you'd been sent home like Harm planned," he rubbed his face with both hands, "you would have died within hours, maybe less." He looked at me directly. "I need to know if you want to file a formal complaint. I'll support you completely either way, but this needs to be documented." My head was fuzzy from the pain meds, but I knew my answer. Yes. Everything needs to be documented properly. He nodded and pulled out his phone to make notes. "Several staff members have already come forward about witnessing what happened." He looked exhausted and kept running his hand through his hair. "I'm so sorry this happened in my ER. I should have known. I should have caught this pattern earlier." He apologized 3 more times before leaving. The next morning, I woke up to someone knocking softly on my door. A young nurse came in looking nervous. "Dr. Callahan? I'm Kira McIntyre. I was the nurse last night when—" She stopped and took a deep breath. "I kept detailed notes with timestamps of everything Dr. Harm said and did to you." She pulled out a small notebook from her pocket, and her hands were shaking. "I wrote it all down right after because I knew it wasn't right, but I was scared to say anything." She showed me pages of neat handwriting with exact times and quotes. "I can't stay quiet anymore. What he did was wrong, and I'll testify if you need me to." She left her personal phone number on my bedside table before rushing out. Later that afternoon, the resident from last night showed up looking like he hadn't slept. Easton Bates stood by the door like he might run away. "Dr. Callahan, I should have spoken up. I knew what he was doing was wrong." He pulled out his own phone and showed me notes he'd typed. "I documented everything too. Times, what he said, how he refused to examine you." His hands shook as he scrolled through the notes. "I know testifying might hurt my career, but I have to do the right thing." He talked for a few more minutes about Harm's pattern of treating older women badly, and how everyone knew, but nobody said anything. After he left, I asked the nurse to bring me my medical chart. Reading through Harm's notes made my stomach turn in a whole different way than the surgery pain. He'd entered psychiatric diagnostic codes before I even collapsed. The chart said I was drug-seeking and showing signs of hysteria common in menopausal women. There were notes about attention-seeking behavior and possible Munchausen syndrome. My insurance would see these codes first when processing claims. The psychiatric labels would affect coverage and create problems for years. My professional knowledge told me this needed immediate correction before it became permanent in my medical record. The nurse helped me request official copies of everything. While I was filling out the forms, someone knocked and walked in carrying a thick folder and wearing a hospital badge that said, "Patient Advocacy." Scarlett Blackwell introduced herself and pulled a chair close to my bed, opening the folder to show me different documents and brochures about patient rights. She explained how the complaint process worked, showing me timelines on a chart and pointing to each step with her pen. She wrote down phone numbers for the State Medical Board and Insurance Appeals Office on a card and put it on my bedside table. She mentioned that 3 other women had filed complaints about Dr. Harm in the past 2 years, but none had gone forward with formal investigations. She helped me fill out the initial complaint form, typing my answers into her tablet while I talked. She took photos of the bruises on my arm where Dr. Harm grabbed me and asked if I wanted to file assault charges too. Before leaving, she gave me her direct number and said she'd check on me every day until discharge. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email from Pete Gorman in the hospital administration asking to schedule a preliminary review meeting for next week. The email used formal language about conducting a thorough investigation and maintaining the highest standards of patient care. Between the lines, I could tell they were taking this seriously because he mentioned that all security footage from that night had been preserved and backed up. He included a list of witnesses they planned to interview and asked if I had anyone else to add. He also attached forms for releasing my medical records to the investigation team. I signed everything electronically and sent it back within the hour. That night, the pain meds wore off around midnight, and I couldn't get back to sleep. I kept thinking about all the women who came through my ER when I was chief, remembering faces of older patients who complained about pain. How many of them got dismissed like I did? How many went home and suffered or died because someone decided they were just hysterical? I thought about the young nurses who watched it happen and stayed quiet because speaking up meant risking their jobs. The guilt sat heavy on my chest, knowing I'd been part of a system that let this happen. I should have seen the pattern when I worked here, but I was too focused on surgeries and budgets to notice what was happening in my own emergency room. But the next morning, my phone rang, and the insurance company representative started reading from Dr. Harm's notes about my supposed drug-seeking behavior and psychiatric symptoms. She said they were denying coverage for the surgery because the initial documentation showed this was a mental health issue, not a medical emergency. I told her about the emergency surgery and the mesenteric torsion, but she kept saying the first assessment is what determines coverage. She read more of his notes, calling me hysterical and attention-seeking. The denial letter would arrive in 5 business days, and I had 30 days to appeal. After hanging up, I called the number Scarlett gave me and got connected to Leonardo Acevedo, an insurance appeals specialist who'd handled cases like mine before. He pulled up my records while we talked and immediately saw the problem with the psychiatric coding Dr. Harm entered. He started building an appeal file with Dr. Vance's operative report and photos from the surgery showing the twisted intestine. He explained that insurance companies often deny first and make you fight for coverage, especially with psychiatric codes in the initial assessment. He warned me the appeal could take 6 to 8 weeks, and I might need to pay the bills up front while we waited. He'd seen this exact situation before with older women whose real medical problems got coded as anxiety or drug-seeking. 2 days later, Haley Stewart from Risk Management called and asked to meet about my situation. She showed up with a leather portfolio and expensive suit, sitting across from me with a practiced smile. She suggested we could handle everything internally without involving the state medical board, saying it would be faster and less stressful for everyone. When I said that wasn't acceptable, her whole demeanor shifted to damage control mode. She started talking about the hospital's commitment to improvement and how they were already implementing new training programs. She pulled out a settlement offer with lots of legal language about releasing the hospital from liability. The number would cover my medical bills if I agreed not to discuss the incident publicly or pursue further action. I pushed the papers back across the table and told her this was about preventing future harm, not money. She left looking frustrated, warning me that going public could affect my position on the board. That evening, I opened my laptop and started writing down everything that happened while the details were still fresh. Each word brought back the humiliation of lying on that floor while Dr. Harm stood over me, refusing to help. I included exact quotes about being called hysterical and drug-seeking, the times he refused to examine me, how he threw paper towels at me when I vomited. I wrote about him prying my fingers off the bed rail and telling security to remove me. I documented that he never once touched my abdomen or did any physical examination before deciding I was faking. The document grew to 12 pages of detailed timeline with everything I could remember. Kira knocked the next morning looking worried and checking over her shoulder before closing the door. She said Dr. Harm had been asking other nurses what they saw that night, trying to get people to say I was being dramatic or difficult. Several nurses were scared of retaliation, but willing to speak up if needed. She pulled out a piece of paper with her personal cell number and pressed it into my hand, saying to call if anything happened, or if I needed her testimony. She mentioned that 2 other nurses had also kept notes about that night. She'd heard rumors that more complaints about Dr. Harm were surfacing now that people knew someone was finally standing up to him. The following week, Pete Gorman came to my room with a laptop and showed me the security footage from that night. We watched me collapse while Dr. Harm stood there with his arms crossed, not moving to help. The video clearly showed him throwing paper towels at me after I vomited. Another angle caught him telling security to remove me while I was unconscious on the floor. Pete's face showed visible disgust as we watched, and he kept apologizing for what happened in his hospital. He said this was the clearest evidence of gross misconduct he'd seen in 20 years of administration. The footage would be part of the permanent record and couldn't be deleted or altered. Dr. Vance stopped by that afternoon and sat down heavily in the visitor chair, looking exhausted. But he told me Dr. Harm had been placed on administrative leave that morning pending the full investigation. They'd started reviewing his other cases from the past year and found a disturbing pattern of dismissing older women with serious conditions. 3 women had been sent home with heart problems he called anxiety, and 1 almost died from appendicitis he diagnosed as gas. The medical review board was taking over the investigation, and more patients were coming forward with similar stories. 3 days after the surgery, my stomach stopped working completely. The nurses tried giving me liquids, but everything came right back up. Dr. Vance ordered tests that showed my intestines had basically shut down from the trauma of waiting so long for surgery. They had to put a tube down my nose into my stomach to drain everything out. The tube hurt going in and made my throat raw. Another tube went into my arm for nutrition since I couldn't eat anything. The nutritionist explained this could have been avoided if they'd operated right away instead of letting my intestines twist for hours. I spent the next 2 days throwing up bile while machines pumped food directly into my veins. My phone buzzed with a text from Easton saying Dr. Harm had removed him from the schedule before the suspension started. He was worried about his evaluation, but said speaking up was worth it. I forwarded his message to Pete Gorman right away, along with screenshots showing the dates. Pete replied that he'd handle it and make sure Easton was protected. The formal interview happened on day 5 when I could finally sit up without getting dizzy. 2 investigators came to my room with laptops and recording equipment. They asked me to go through everything from the beginning while one typed and the other took notes. Every few minutes they'd stop to clarify details or ask follow-up questions. They wanted exact times, exact words, exact actions. The woman investigator mentioned they already had statements from 6 witnesses, including nurses who were in the room. She said this was the most documented case of misconduct she'd seen in 15 years of doing these reviews. The interview took 3 hours and left me exhausted. Haley Stewart showed up the next morning with a folder full of papers. She sat down and explained the hospital wanted to offer me a settlement to cover my medical bills and lost wages. The number she mentioned would pay for everything, plus some extra for pain and suffering. But then she showed me the terms, which included never talking about what happened, never posting online, never contacting media, and never pursuing any other legal action. I told her this wasn't about money, but about making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. She said the hospital understood but needed to protect its reputation. I pushed the papers back across the table and said no. She gathered them up and said she'd be in touch if the terms changed. My recovery was going terrible because of the delay in treatment. The physical therapist came twice a day to help me walk, but I could barely make it to the bathroom without help. Each step hurt, and my stomach muscles wouldn't work right. The therapist said the prolonged twisting had damaged the nerves and muscles in ways that might be permanent. We measured progress in tiny amounts, like being able to stand for 30 seconds longer or walking 5 more feet. Every painful session reminded me this could have been avoided if Dr. Harm had just examined me. Scarlett came by with a stack of paperwork for the state medical board complaint. She explained each section and helped me write out the details in the right format. The forms wanted specific medical codes, exact timeline, witness information, and copies of all my medical records. We spent 4 hours going through everything to make sure it was complete. Scarlett said the board needed to know about Dr. Harm's pattern, even if the hospital handled things internally. She'd seen too many doctors just move to different hospitals without anyone knowing their history. 2 days later, Scarlett called to say 2 other women had contacted her after hearing about my case. Both were older women who Dr. Harm had dismissed with serious conditions. The first one had chest pain he called anxiety and sent home with antacids. She had a heart attack in the parking lot and barely survived. The second woman had stomach pain he said was gas and refused to run tests on. She ended up having her appendix burst at home and needed emergency surgery at a different hospital. Both women wanted to add their stories to the state board complaint. Scarlett was helping them with the paperwork and said having multiple victims would make the case much stronger. Pete Gorman scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss the investigation findings. The conference room had administrators, lawyers, Dr. Vance, and 2 board members. Pete laid out all the evidence, including the video footage, witness statements, my medical records showing the delay caused permanent damage, and the pattern of similar cases they'd found. The hospital's lawyer reviewed everything and said they had clear grounds for termination with cause. Dr. Vance added that 3 more cases had come to light where Dr. Harm dismissed women over 50 with serious conditions. The board members looked sick as they reviewed the evidence. One of them said this was the worst case of discrimination and malpractice she'd seen. They voted to move forward with termination proceedings immediately. The next day, a certified letter arrived from Dr. Harm's lawyer claiming the investigation was unfair and biased. The letter said Dr. Harm was suffering from burnout, and the hospital had failed to provide adequate support. It threatened a wrongful termination lawsuit if they fired him. The lawyer claimed I was exaggerating my symptoms, and the video didn't show the full context. Haley Stewart seemed worried when Pete showed her the letter, but Pete said they had rock-solid evidence and wouldn't back down. He'd dealt with these threats before and knew most doctors wouldn't actually sue because it would make all the evidence public. Leonardo called that afternoon with partially good news about the insurance appeal. After reviewing all the documentation and the corrected medical codes, they agreed to cover the surgery and most of the hospital stay. But they were still denying coverage for the complications and extended recovery since those happened after the initial treatment. I'd still owe about $8,000, but it was better than the $40,000 they originally denied. Leonardo said we could keep fighting, but it might take months and wasn't guaranteed to work. 3 days later, Vance called and asked if I'd speak at the monthly mortality and morbidity conference about my case. My hands shook when I hung up the phone because patients almost never present at M&M conferences, but Vance said the staff needed to hear directly from me. I spent the next week writing notes and practicing what I'd say, even though my stomach still hurt when I stood too long. The morning of the conference, I put on my best suit and took extra pain medication just to get through it. Walking into that packed auditorium made my legs feel weak, because I saw at least 200 medical staff staring at me. I gripped the podium and started with the facts about coming to the ER that night and exactly what Harm said and did. My voice cracked when I described him throwing paper towels at me while I was on the floor, but I kept going through each detail. The room stayed completely silent, and I noticed several nurses wiping their eyes and doctors looking down at their hands. When I finished, nobody clapped or moved for what felt like forever, until Vance stood up and thanked me for my courage. During the discussion period, a young resident raised her hand and admitted she'd seen similar dismissive behavior, but didn't know how to speak up against senior doctors. 3 more residents nodded, and one said the hierarchy made it impossible to challenge attending physicians, even when they knew something was wrong. An older nurse stood up and shared that she'd been written up twice for questioning doctors who dismissed female patients' pain. The conversation got heated when some doctors defended the pressure of emergency medicine, but others pushed back, saying that was no excuse for what happened to me. A week after the conference, Pete called to tell me Harm's disciplinary hearing was scheduled and I needed to testify again. I sat in that conference room facing Harm for the first time since that night and watched him blame everything on being overworked and stressed. He claimed I was exaggerating, and that any reasonable doctor would have made the same assessment given the circumstances. He showed no remorse and actually rolled his eyes when I described the permanent digestive problems I now had from the delayed surgery. The panel members asked him direct questions about why he never examined me, and he kept deflecting with excuses about patient volume and limited resources. When they showed him the video of him standing over me on the floor doing nothing, he said I was being dramatic and manipulative. His lawyer tried to argue that one bad night shouldn't end a career, but the panel wasn't buying it after seeing the pattern of similar cases. 2 days later, Pete called with the decision that Harm was terminated with cause, and they were reporting everything to the state medical board. Harm would have to disclose this termination to any future employer and explain why he lost his hospital privileges. The next morning, Kira texted me that some of the ER staff were giving her the cold shoulder and someone had written "snitch" on her locker. She was trying to stay strong, but I could tell it was wearing on her, so I immediately called Scarlett, who documented everything, and got HR involved. I wrote a formal letter to the administration praising Kira's courage and professionalism in speaking up for patient safety. Scarlett made sure security cameras were checked, and the person who vandalized Kira's locker got suspended for a week. Meanwhile, Easton sent me a worried text about his upcoming evaluation because Harm had been his supervising attending before the suspension. Vance personally reviewed Easton's file and changed what would have been a negative evaluation to a neutral one that focused on his clinical skills. Easton got matched with a new attending who valued integrity and actually praised him for having the courage to report misconduct. He texted me a photo of his new schedule with a supportive message about being glad he spoke up even though it was scary. 6 weeks after my surgery, I finally managed to eat a normal meal without pain, though I still had to be careful about portion sizes. The physical therapist said my recovery was slower than it should have been because of how long the torsion went untreated, but I was making progress. I still woke up some nights in a panic, remembering Harm's face as he stood over me refusing to help. My therapist said that was normal trauma response and would get better with time, but I wasn't sure I'd ever fully trust doctors again. Around that time, the hospital sent out an email announcing new protocols for emergency room complaints and mandatory bias training for all staff. They were putting a patient advocate on every shift and creating a new system where patients could request a second opinion without fear of retaliation. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and I knew my case had forced these changes, even though they should have happened years ago. Pete told me privately that complaints about dismissive treatment had already dropped 30% since word got out about what happened to Harm. 2 months after the incident, I walked back into the hospital boardroom for my first meeting since everything happened. Several board members came up to me before the meeting started to express their outrage about my treatment and support for the changes. When we got to new business, I made a motion to triple the funding for patient advocacy programs and require quarterly reports on complaint patterns. The vote was unanimous, and the board chair said this would be her personal priority going forward to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. 3 weeks later, the state medical board investigator called and asked for copies of everything I had. I spent the whole afternoon scanning medical records, witness statements, and the security footage Pete had saved on a flash drive. The investigator, a woman who sounded tired on the phone, said they'd already gotten 4 other complaints about Dr. Harm from different hospitals where he'd worked before. She wanted me to come in for a formal interview next week and said they were taking this pattern very seriously. I drove to their office downtown and spent 3 hours going through every detail while she typed notes and asked follow-up questions about specific things he'd said. She showed me a thick file with his name on it and said, mine wasn't even close to the worst case they'd documented. 2 days after that interview, I went back to the hospital for a follow-up appointment and noticed the ER had a different feel to it. The new doctor they'd hired to replace Harm was a young woman who I watched greet every patient with eye contact and a real smile. The nurses seemed more relaxed, and I saw one actually challenge a diagnosis without getting yelled at. Kira saw me in the hallway and pulled me aside to tell me how much better things were now that everyone felt safe speaking up for patients. She said complaint rates had dropped by half already, and staff were actually happy to come to work again. That same week, Scarlett called to say 2 other women who'd filed complaints about Harm wanted to meet with me. We gathered at a coffee shop near the hospital and spent 2 hours sharing our stories. One woman, probably in her 70s, had almost died from a heart problem Harm dismissed as anxiety. The other one had suffered for months with undiagnosed gallstones he'd called menopause symptoms. We exchanged phone numbers and decided to meet monthly as a support group for people who'd experienced medical gaslighting. It felt good knowing I wasn't alone in this, and that we could help each other heal from the trauma of not being believed when we needed help most. The following Monday, my final medical bills arrived in a thick envelope that made my stomach hurt just looking at it. Even with insurance covering most of the surgery, I still owed $8,300 for various fees and uncovered services. I called the billing department and after being transferred 4 times, finally got someone who understood my situation. They offered a payment plan of $200 a month and said they could forgive about 30% given what had happened with Harm. It was still a huge financial burden, but at least I wouldn't have to drain my entire savings account to pay it. By the time 3 months had passed since my surgery, I could finally eat most normal foods again, though I had to be careful about portions and timing. My surgeon examined me and said the digestive problems were probably permanent because of how long the torsion went untreated before surgery. He prescribed special enzymes to help with digestion and suggested I might need to stay on them forever. I had to plan every meal carefully now, and always knew where the nearest bathroom was when I went out. Some days were better than others, but I was learning to live with these new limitations, even though they were completely preventable if Harm had just done his job. The state board finally scheduled Harm's hearing for next month and sent me an official notice to testify. I'd have to drive to the Capitol and spend the whole day there, but I was ready to tell my story again if it meant protecting future patients. The letter said 4 other patients would also testify, and they'd have several expert witnesses discussing standard of care violations. Scarlett helped me prepare my testimony and said having multiple victims speak would make the case much stronger. Pete stopped by my house one evening with a folder full of statistics about the ER since they'd implemented the new protocols. Complaint rates had dropped 70%. Patient satisfaction scores were the highest they'd been in 5 years, and staff retention had improved dramatically. He showed me graphs and charts proving that the changes we'd forced were actually working. He said the board was so impressed they were thinking about making our hospital's new system a model for others in the state. The next week, I started volunteering with the patient advocacy program 2 days a week. My first day, I helped an elderly man navigate a complaint about a doctor who wouldn't refill his heart medication without an expensive test he couldn't afford. My medical background meant I could translate the technical stuff, and my personal experience meant I understood the fear and frustration of not being heard. By my 3rd week volunteering, I'd helped 12 people file complaints or appeals, and it felt like I was turning my trauma into something useful. 6 weeks after the hearing, the state board's decision arrived by certified mail. Dr. Harm's medical license was suspended for 2 years, and he'd have to complete extensive remediation before he could practice again. The requirements included bias training, supervised practice when he returned, and quarterly reviews for 5 years after reinstatement. It wasn't the permanent revocation I'd hoped for, but it was still significant and would follow him for the rest of his career. That same week, Kira got promoted to charge nurse with a big raise and expanded responsibilities. She came to find me during my volunteer shift to share the news and thank me for supporting her when others tried to silence her. She'd already started training other nurses on how to document concerns and advocate for patients even when doctors pushed back. Watching her confidence grow from that scared nurse who'd whispered her concerns to me to this strong advocate made everything we'd been through feel worth it. 3 months passed before Easton stopped by the hospital during my volunteer shift and found me helping an older woman appeal her insurance denial. He wore his white coat with attending physician embroidered on it and carried himself differently now, more confident but also more careful. He pulled me aside near the coffee station and told me he'd finished his residency with excellent evaluations and matched into a hospitalist position at a teaching hospital 2 hours away. He said that night in the ER changed everything about how he practices medicine, and now he always listens when patients describe their symptoms, especially older women who other doctors might dismiss. He showed me a photo on his phone of his new office where he'd hung a sign that said, "The patient is the expert on their own body," right above his desk. The hospital announced their new annual Patient Safety Award 6 weeks later at the quarterly all-staff meeting, and Pete asked me to present it. They didn't name the award after me, but called it the Courage and Advocacy Award for healthcare workers who speak up against unsafe practices. The first recipient was Kira, and when I called her name, she walked to the podium with tears streaming down her face. She took the plaque with both hands and hugged me, so tight I could barely breathe. The room erupted in applause, and I saw several nurses wiping their eyes. Pete had included a $5,000 bonus with the award, and Kira whispered that she was going to use it for her daughter's college fund. The following spring, I flew to Chicago for a national healthcare conference where Vance was presenting our hospital's new protocols as a model for patient safety. The conference room was packed with administrators and doctors from hospitals across the country. Vance clicked through slides showing our complaint statistics and staff satisfaction scores while explaining how one incident catalyzed necessary changes. He mentioned my name 3 times and credited me with forcing the hospital to confront its toxic culture. After his presentation, representatives from 12 hospitals approached him about implementing similar programs. A woman from Seattle gave him her card and said they'd had 3 malpractice suits from dismissed female patients in the past year. 2 weeks after the conference, a thick envelope arrived at my house with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named Madeline, who lived 3 states away. She wrote that a nurse at her local hospital had refused to let a doctor discharge her without proper testing because she'd heard about our case at a training session. The tests revealed early-stage ovarian cancer that would have killed her within months if untreated. She thanked me for speaking up and said I'd saved her life even though we'd never met. She included a photo of her grandchildren and said she'd get to watch them grow up because of what we'd done. I kept that letter in my nightstand and read it whenever I doubted whether the fight had been worth it. My digestive system never fully recovered from the delayed surgery, and I had to take enzymes with every meal. The scar tissue caused random sharp pains that made me double over without warning. My doctor prescribed medication to manage the symptoms, but warned me these issues were probably permanent. I learned which foods triggered the worst reactions and kept antispasmodics in my purse at all times. Some days were better than others, but I'd accepted this new reality. The support group for medical gaslighting survivors grew faster than we expected. We met monthly in the hospital's community room, and by our 6th meeting, we had 30 regular members. People drove from neighboring towns to attend and share their stories. We helped a woman get proper treatment for lupus after 3 doctors called her a hypochondriac. We coached a man through filing a complaint against an ER that sent him home with chest pains that turned out to be a heart attack. We created a resource guide with sample complaint letters and contact information for patient advocates at every hospital in the state. One member started a private Facebook group that grew to 300 members within 2 months. The 2-year anniversary of my ER visit coincided with the quarterly board meeting where we reviewed patient safety metrics. Pete presented charts showing ER complaints had dropped 70% since implementing the new protocols. Staff satisfaction scores hit an all-time high, with nurses reporting they felt empowered to advocate for patients. The average time to treatment decreased by 30 minutes, even though doctors were spending more time with each patient. Insurance claim denials based on improper documentation dropped by half. The board voted unanimously to increase funding for patient advocacy programs and expand bias training to all departments. After the meeting, several board members told me privately that my experience had fundamentally changed how they thought about patient care. These days, I spend 3 mornings a week at the hospital doing advocacy work, and it gives my life purpose I hadn't expected to find in retirement. Seeing young doctors like Easton practice with genuine compassion makes me hopeful about medicine's future. The system isn't perfect and probably never will be, but it's significantly better than it was 2 years ago. Sometimes that's the best victory you can hope for, and I've learned to celebrate every small improvement because they add up to real change that saves lives. Thanks for hanging out with me on this one. It's been a ride, and I'm glad we got to share these moments together. I'll catch you in the next one. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.